All right. So tonight we're going to be talking about utilitarianism. And it's a moral philosophy that's been incredibly influential. So we've talked about, we spent a lot of time talking about virtue ethics, and there the main person really is Aristotle, even though we talked about Hume. And Aristotle is writing over 2,000 years ago. Well, that way of thinking about the world was incredibly influential and really didn't start to change until we start to hit some interesting ideas in the 17 and 1800s, right? Just depending on who we want to call the first utilitarians. But starting around, the 18th and the 19th century, we get some alternatives to virtue ethics. Namely, we get Immanuel Kant in his version of deontology, and we get Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, Henry Sidgwick, and a group of other philosophers who become known as the utilitarians or the consequentialists. And this moral theory is incredibly powerful, and in a lot of ways, it's really easy to characterize. But the devil is in the details and kind of what happens whenever you start to apply this philosophy. So tonight, I'm going to characterize utilitarianism. I'm going to give some historical background. But then we're also going to talk about a contemporary case, namely Peter Singer, to see how contemporary utilitarians deal with moral problems. Okay, so there's going to be I'm going to cover a lot, and obviously you aren't responsible for all of this. You're only responsible for the stuff that's in the syllabus, okay? But I wanted to give a broader lecture that gives some historical background so you can kind of understand what's going on. So just as review, remember that whenever we were thinking about utilitarian philosophy, virtue ethics, we had two questions. What does it mean to live a good, meaningful, happy life? And then number two, what kind of person do I need to become in order to live that way, right? So you have these holistic concerns about having a good life and becoming a certain kind of person that can achieve that, right? And whenever you talk about whether something is right or wrong, it has to be contextualized within a specific person's life and in all of those considerations, right? Not so much with utilitarianism or Kantianism. Okay, we'll get to the Kantian theory later. But with utilitarian theory, it's basically this. An action is right if and only if its consequences promote the most good or avoid the most bad. Okay, so what's kind of interesting here and why I've put a picture of dominoes is whenever you're looking at actions and trying to decide which ones to do, what you do to compare your different alternatives is to see what are the consequences. This is why it's called consequentialism sometimes. Or what are the effects, right? The results of you doing that particular thing. It's not so much focused on the action itself. It's more focused on what happens as a result of what's going on. Okay? And then you want to look at those consequences. Look at what happens as a result. Does it cause more good than bad? If it causes more good than bad, then you have to do that thing. Or negatively, if it avoids more bad than the other options, it's the least evil, right? Then you do that thing. But you're always trying to choose the action that has the best outcome, the best consequences for all involved. Okay? So the short, pithy way that people often put this is a theory that says you need to do the action that produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people. The greatest good for the greatest number of people. That's what you're after here. That's what you're after here, right? So there's a few different features here. It's an act-based moral theory. So compared to the virtue ethics, which is character-based, so you're concerned about a life, right? You're concerned about a person, and actions only make sense in relation to that. Here we are talking about actions. Actions are the most important, the most primary thing here. It's focused on the results or the effects. This is also known as instrumental reasoning. Instrumental means that what you're trying to do is you're trying to figure out what some action is good for. Good for, okay? That's in contrast to intrinsic reasoning, which means you're trying to look at the good in and of itself. All right, we'll get that with Kant. But with here, what we're trying to do here is we're trying only to choose the actions that are good for promoting the most good or avoiding the most bad. Okay? Our actions are an instrument, they're a tool to bring about the best consequences. That's what's going on here. Utilitarianism as well, and this is in contrast to virtue ethics, this is completely impartial. Okay? So especially we saw this in Hume. Hume was perfectly okay with us, for example, valuing our children over a complete stranger. Not so with utilitarian, all right? Not so. At least the main views of utilitarianism are the most like historically powerful ones. Everyone's good and bad counts for the same. It's incredibly egalitarian, right? Side note, this is also why the utilitarians tend to be ahead of the curve on pretty much every single social issue. Okay, we're going to talk about Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham was like okay with decriminalizing gay relationships. He was very much a feminist and tried to promote women's rights. He might have begun talking about animal rights. He got a lot of things right. Anti-slavery, anti-public punishment, corporal punishment, so where you're beating people. Anti-capital punishment, I believe as well, although I'm not as sure on that one. John Stuart Mill, who was his student, another utilitarian, he did so many different things. He tried to talk about contraceptives and why they should be allowed, right? And he wrote a very famous piece of feminist philosophy along with his partner later on in his life, where they basically defended the rights of women. So the utilitarians, as much flack as they kind of get in contemporary philosophy, they tend to be on the right side of history, which is really, really interesting. And maybe it's something that we can consider as we move on. But I think part of that comes from the fact that they are trying to use a philosophy that is completely impartial. And in the sense that all of our good and all of our suffering counts for the same. We can't privilege certain perspectives over the other. And that means that we need to do the things that are the most beneficial for the most people, right? And historically, right, this has come in two varieties. Now, there are many, many different other varieties, and there's debates as to how exactly to separate these or to think about them. But for the sake of this course, given that it's introductory, we're going to only talk about two particular varieties: hedonism, which is the philosophy of Jeremy Bentham, and eudaimonism, which is the philosophy of John Stuart Mill. So they're both utilitarians. They both want to do the action that produces the most good for the most number of people, right? But what the good is differs. For Jeremy Bentham, the good that we're trying to maximize is pleasure, and the bad that we're trying to minimize is pain. For Mill, the good that we're trying to maximize is happiness, eudaimonia, right? That's why it's called eudaimonism. The bad that we're trying to minimize is unhappiness, right? And so that matters, right? That matters. Hedonism is a fair bit simpler. It's easier to sort of understand whenever something is in pleasure or in pain. Eudaimonism is more complex, and maybe that helps with certain things. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe you don't want to do that. But those are the two varieties that we're going to talk about tonight. Okay. So I put these pictures here because you need to know this. Jeremy Bentham was an incredibly influential economist and thinker, philosopher, all sorts of stuff. And he was involved with the founding of London University, which now is known as University College London. And I believe he gave part of his estate to UCL. And one of the conditions was that his auto icon would be saved at the university and he could steer the university and keep shaping its mission, right? Auto icon just is a fancy word for his corpse, okay? So they literally have a closet with his skeleton inside of like clothing filled with straw and stuff like that. And so I'm pretty sure his skeleton is in there. And his head is preserved. So the guy that they got to preserve Jeremy Bentham's head decided to use a new technique whenever he was preserving Bentham's head. And this technique should have produced better results, but he hadn't really, used it that often, maybe at all. He completely messed it up because the image on the bottom there is Jeremy Bentham's head. So you can see him, like IRL, pale-skinned guy, pretty portly, right? The head below, I mean, basically it shrunk the skin, it shriveled it in certain ways, and it changed the color. It kind of looks like leather, right? Just outright leather. And so that's a weird story. Sometimes I've heard stories, I haven't been able to confirm them, that rival colleges would steal Jeremy Bentham's head, right? That kind of stuff. So it's just a weird piece of history. I like weird ideas, so I'm sharing that with you. So Jeremy Bentham, what's going on here? Well, I just said that his view is hedonistic. Hedone is the Greek word for pleasure. And so here we know that with all of these philosophies we're going to talk about tonight, it's about promoting the most good or avoiding the most bad. But the debate is, what is the good and what is the bad? For Bentham, the good is pleasure, the bad is pain, right? Now this is, it's a gamble, right? It's a gamble. And I'll tell you why. The good is that it's really easy to tell whenever any sort of animal likes the situation they're in, right? They're living well, they're replicating, they pursue certain things, and the opposite, it's also easy to tell when an animal is in pain. They recoil from that stimulus, they don't go back toward it, maybe they exhibit some sort of fear response in their neurophysiology, right? So these things are easy to observe, and it's not just human, right? You can do this with non-human animals as well. Maybe you can even do this with plants. They're sort of seeing that plants release stress chemical signals to communicate to other plants that something bad is going on, right? You can observe this really easily. The downside is you start to run into a lot of the objections, and we'll come to it, that the hedonist or the Epicurean philosophers ran into, okay? But what's interesting about Jeremy Bentham, and one thing that people don't often give enough credit for, is that he spends a lot of time showing that both pleasure and pain are really complex, okay? Because they vary in these different qualities: intensity, duration, certainty, remoteness, fecundity, purity, and extent, okay? Now, what that basically means is something like intensity, right? That's easy to understand. So if you basically scratch an itch, that feels good, right? But it's not all that intense. Whereas if you have something like an orgasm, that's a really, really intense pleasure, right? Or pains, right? If you get, a bit of a bump whenever you're getting up from your desk, not that bad, right? Not that bad. Maybe getting into like a serious car crash, really, really intense pain. Same with the duration. How long do the pleasures and the pains last? Certainty. So whenever you're projecting actions into the future, how certain is it that something is going to be pain or pleasure? And remoteness is how far away is it? Fecundity and purity. You don't need to know the exact details of this, but it's just like, what is the probability that a pleasure keeps producing a pleasure, or that it switches, right, and turns into a pain? So, for example, I can eat pizza, and the first slice or two are really, really fantastic, right? But if I keep eating more and more pizza, eventually I get sick and I start to feel disgusted with myself, right? So that's an example of how, even though something might start out as a pleasure, it might eventually end as a pain, depending on the details of what's going on. And extent is, how many people is this action involving, right? Because this isn't egoistic. It's not just about me. It's about, communities overall. It's about a lot of different people, all right? So that's something that's really, really important to consider, all right? So despite the fact that hedonism gets this reputation for being super simplistic and for, only talking about pleasure and pain, right? It's something that we see in humans and non-humans, and maybe it's reductive in a certain sense. Aren't we more than just pleasure and pain organisms, right? Robots detecting which is more pleasurable or which is more painful. I don't know. But despite that sort of bad reputation, Bentham is very quick to point out pleasure and pain, even though they are sort of easy to observe, and he does think those are the goods and the bads, and that is how we should be gauging things. They are very complex whenever you start to break them down, right? Because like I said, do the greatest good for the greatest number. It's not so important what the action is, it's more important what follows from it. So if we take the example of, say, telling a white lie, right? You've now seen me probably for a few videos, right? I have this sort of like COVID haircut going. It's long. I'm not looking the best. I'm not like, working out as much as I used to. But like, let's say that I'm hanging out with my friend, and I finally decide to go on a properly socially distanced date with someone, right? And I'm just about to head out of the house. And before I head out, I ask my friend or my roommate, hey, do I look okay, right? And my friend knows, like, I'm wearing my best clothes. I took a shower. I've done the best that I can to groom myself, right? And I'm really just asking for a bit of a confidence booster, right? Because there's nothing in my teeth, there's nothing stuck in my beard. That happens sometimes too. But the honest truth is I look like shit, right? And so you can think, what should I do, right? From the perspective of my friend, should I tell this white lie or should I not? The utilitarian philosophers are going to say, don't focus so much on the action, telling the lie or telling the truth. What you need to focus on are what are the effects, okay? So if you tell the truth to someone like me, and I'm sensitive, and you say that I look terrible, right? That might get under my skin. It might make the date go worse because now I'm like, in addition to being anxious about COVID or whatever else, I'm also just like anxious about looking like crap, right? Versus telling a little bit of a lie, saying, "Hey, you're looking pretty good, man. Like, I think your date's gonna be really impressed, right?" What are the effects of that? Potentially increasing my confidence, potentially helping me out. So it doesn't matter that you had to tell a small lie to produce the to produce the better effects, right? Because the action itself doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. What matters are the effects. Okay, that's what's going on here. So what are the effects? What are the metrics that we're using to measure the effects, pleasure and pain on Bentham's account? All right. And this, I think, is a very elegant and a powerful theory. And some people would argue that utilitarianism should basically stop here. There's a lot of very complex varieties of utilitarianism or consequentialism, some that have value pluralism, so they'll include tons of different things, and you kind of all try to maximize them and balance them out. Some consequentialists are going to say that's a mistake. Just stick with hedonism. We know what pleasure and pain are. We know roughly how, like, maybe we can't quantify them in an exact amount, right? But if we're comparing two cases side by side, we can fairly clearly tell which one produces more pleasure or avoids more pain. Don't overcomplicate this. Keep it simple, right? Keep it simple. If you have that sort of perspective, hedonism or hedonistic utilitarianism is the philosophy that you definitely want, right? But I said that this is often seen as demeaning, right? So some people will say, look, hedonism is really demeaning. And doesn't this mean we should live like swine? Think about a pig. And think about how happy a pig is if it has mud to wallow in, if it has slop to eat, right? And if it has a partner to have sex with. That's a fantastic life if you're a hedonist. Because if it's all about pleasure, maximizing pleasure and avoiding pain, then that's basically all we need, right? That's basically all we need. Doesn't that reduce us into really simplistic creatures? Isn't there something bad about taking that view of humanity, right? So that's the swine's philosophy objection. If you only measure the consequences based on pleasure and pain, you're reducing humanity to a very small set of values, And it seems like we should probably live the lives of pigs rather than really complicated adults who strive for various things or do things like study philosophy or read poetry or whatever else. Okay? All right. So I'm going to take this opportunity and throughout the lecture to kind of show you some philosopher's tricks. This first set of tricks is kind of how do you reply to an opponent who is giving you an objection and you agree that you need to address it. You might not agree that it's a big deal, but you agree that, a lot of people think this thing and I need to take it head on. Okay? Well, reply number one that you can do is what's called biting the bullet. Okay? And what biting the bullet means is you basically accept the conclusion. You accept what your opponent says, but you try to find some sort of rhetorical or PR way to soften the effects of what that means, right? Soften the effects. You sort of say, yeah, that's the conclusion, but that's not how I'd put it, right? And in fact, I'd put it in this way. So you're addressing the criticism, but you're addressing it more in like a PR sort of way or a press secretary sort of way. The decision's been made, you agree with the decision, but now you have to find a different way of presenting it so that people don't see it as all that bad, right? The upside of this is that it kind of takes minimal effort. You don't have to go back to the drawing board or reform your theory, right? The downside is, potentially, it maintains the problems, right? So it doesn't do anything to get rid of the objection because you bite the bullet. You just kind of accept it, right? So that's why you may or may not choose this. How does that relate to this in particular? Well, the Epicureans, an ancient Greek and Roman set of philosophers, are going to say something very similar because they were hedonists. They weren't utilitarians, but they did believe that pleasure was the highest good and pain was the bad, right? And whenever someone would say that, look, you're demeaning humankind, they'd say, look, no. Because it turns out that like whenever you start to talk about all of the luxuries, what are you talking about, right? Do we need fancy meals? Do we need fancy drink? Do we need couches? Do we need, people who dance in front of us to our delight? No. Most of those luxuries are bullshit, right? And also something that the utilitarian pays special attention to is they say, look, you might think that those things are actually very, very good, but whenever you look into everything that goes into preparing that or how difficult those things to acquire, to all of the trouble with a lot of these luxuries, you start to see that they're not worth what you're paying for them. They bring a whole lot more pain than pleasure, right? So the Epicureans tend to say, simplify your life, live more naturally, right? Eat a simple diet, keep stock of your psychology, and try to live a simple life. Why? Because if you do that, you'll be able to enjoy more pleasures long term. And if you go after those things supposedly that make us human, like poetry or, complex whatever, right? You'll see that you're miserable for most of the time. And then whenever you attain that great goal, it's actually not all that pleasing, right? Okay. So one objection to the swine's philosophy, right? To say that the hedonist just makes us into like really simple creatures and that we should live the life of the pig. They just find a way to put that in a softer way, right? I prefer to call it living simply, right? And we should do that because look at all of the luxuries that you live in now. It turns out that they're not all that pleasurable whenever you put in the consideration to see all of the pain and the trouble that you go to get something really complex, right? A luxury car. Fine. Now you drive a luxury car. But think about all of the hours that you had to work away from your friends and family to get that. Think about how high your insurance premiums are. And think about what that does for you. Like, are you stressed out whenever you drive? If you go to a grocery store, do you have to park really far away? Do you have to go places where, you get things valeted? What's going on, right? You take something that is supposedly a really great pleasure, and once you start to look at everything that it takes to get that and to maintain that, turns out it's really like not that good. So that's an example of biting the bullet. You just kind of agree. It's like, yeah, I get what you're saying, and for the most part, you have the ideas kind of right, but here's how I would put it. Now, the second option is to revise your theory in light of the criticisms. Okay? Revise your theory in light of the criticisms. So if the critique is that pleasure and pain are way too simple for complex humanity, then maybe we can find some other type of metric. Okay? The downside of this is it's a lot of effort. You have to revise your theory. You have to go back to the drawing board and sort of figure out how to make your theory in a way that gets around the objections. But the upside is you avoid the objection, right? Because you've trained to avoid what your opponent is going to throw at you, right? And this roughly is kind of what John Stuart Mill is doing whenever he's changing from hedonism to eudaimonism, whenever he's changing from maximizing pleasure to maximizing happiness, all right? But I want to take a quick detour because John Stuart Mill is rather remarkable. And I've already, alluded to a little bit of this, but like by age 3, he was learning ancient Greek. All right. To give you perspective, by age 3, I don't know, maybe I was like being potty trained. By age 8, he'd read the Greek classics in the original, so he started Latin. By the time I was 8, I think I was kind of learning to cross the street, right? Age 10, he'd read Plato in the Greek. By the time I was age 10, I think I'd looked through most of the zoo books in my elementary school library, right? So the magazines that had animals or whatever else. Age 17, he was arrested for helping poor people get contraceptives, okay? So he's politically active. Again, this is kind of one of the really interesting things about Bentham and Mill and later on Peter Singer. Age 17, I think I could play The Four Horsemen by Metallica. It's an old thrash metal song on the guitar, right? Age 20, he had a mental breakdown. So he had been pushed very, very hard by his father, and he was in charge of the education of his siblings. And this eventually led to burnout or to him having a mental breakdown. So what did he do? He rehabilitated himself through poetry and art. So he became a very astute, at least consumer, but maybe even critic of the art forms. By age 20, I didn't really have a mental breakdown necessarily, but I did make the mental mistake of choosing philosophy as a career, right? Still not sure whether that was good or bad, right? So now we can get on to John Stuart Mill, right? So as I've said, the good is happiness, think eudaimonia, and the bad is unhappiness. Now, this isn't an uncontroversial way of reading John Stuart Mill, but I think it's the way that makes the most sense, especially given that he had studied the classics so in depth, right? And so now he's not just talking about pleasure. Pleasure is part of eudaimonia. It is part of happiness for Aristotle, right? But it's only a small part. You need to do other things like develop yourself, engage other people, right? That type of happiness, that sort of long-term life, an entire life lived well, that's what we're trying to get at with this eudaimonic interpretation of utilitarianism, okay? But he uses this eventually to make a higher-lower pleasures distinction, all right? And so why this matters is because he's going to say, look, think of the swine's philosophy objection. I get that you're trying to say that hedonism demeans people, right? But that's why I'm not a hedonist. I'm a eudaimonist. And one of the important things, what I'm calling the psychological thesis here, is that humans have higher faculties than pigs, right? We have different minds that are way more complex. And so what this eventually means, and I didn't know what to call this, but I called it the comparative thesis, is that pleasures that engage the higher faculties count infinitely, maybe, more than those that engage the lower faculties. Okay? So think about, think about the pleasure of, I love the fall, right? think about the pleasure of eating some pizza and watching a horror movie. If you're into horror, it's a really great experience. Feels good, right? But is that nearly as good as, say, the pleasure of, working on something that you've been striving after really long term, right? And it could be anything. So for me, maybe it's something like writing my first book. Okay? The difference between me sitting around watching schlocky horror films and eating pizza and me writing a book are vast. It might cause pain and discomfort and take a ton of work to do something like write a book, but I'm using all of my faculties, and presumably my accomplishment of having written a book is way more important or shows way more about my humanity or who I am. It contributes way more to my flourishing than just eating pizza and watching schlocky horror films. That's what Mill is going to say. That's what Mill is going to say. You don't have to buy it, but that's what Mill is going to try to say. And in fact, this is how he puts it. This is a very famous passage from chapter 2 of Utilitarianism. It is indisputable that the being whose capacities of enjoyment are low has the greatest chance of having them fully satisfied. And a highly endowed being will always feel that any happiness which he can look for, as the world is constituted, is imperfect. But he can learn to bear its imperfections if they are at all bearable, and they will not make him envy the being who is indeed unconscious of the imperfections, but only because he feels not at all the goods which those imperfections qualify. This is the important part. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig is of a different opinion, it is only because they only know their own side of the question. So what Mill is trying to say is, to a certain extent, he agrees. He's like, look, I agree that if you're a pig, there's a better chance of you getting all of your desires satisfied, right? Or feeling all of the pleasures that you can feel. If you're a fool, right? So he just calls them a fool who likes to just play Xbox and eat junk food or whatever else. Then okay, that's a whole lot easier to satisfy than writing a book or reading intense literature, or even just not delving just into schlocky films, but really serious films, right? Studying the medium, becoming a critic, writing and reading lots of reviews, that kind of thing, right? That's much harder. And he admits, look, the fool, they're going to be way more content with life. Whereas people who are complex, who need the really big aspirational goals, they're often really miserable. But if you get any amount of the higher types of pleasures, it's worth so much more than the small amount of like the lower types of pleasures, right? So a really fantastically prepared meal with great ingredients that's been meticulously made to your palate and cooked very, very well. Maybe it's in a great environment with a couple of your closest friends. That kind of meal is worth any number of chicken nuggets, right? Chicken nuggets are easy to get. They're tasty, right? But they're not as good as like high culinary art. That's what Mill is trying to get us to say. And he's saying, moreover, if we disagree, it's likely because we're the fool and we don't understand the higher pleasures. So he's trying to make this distinction, right? He's trying to make this distinction because that's what can get him out of the way of the swine's philosophy objection, right? Why shouldn't we live like swine? We have way more complicated faculties. That's why, right? That's why. And so someone could come back to him, right? And say, well, so like people who I know who are intelligent and creative, they're really miserable, right? And it's really hard to do the things that they want to do. Why should anyone go through all of that misery? And Mill says, because any amount of success in achieving those great things is worth an innumerable amount of the lower types of pleasures or goals. Okay? And so that's what he's trying to say. That's what he's trying to say. So again, just to repeat, greatest good for the greatest number. Not so much the action itself, but the effects or the consequences of the results. Jeremy Bentham said that the good is pleasure, the bad is pain. John Stuart Mill is saying, no, the good is happiness in the sense of a full, flourishing human life, and the bad is unhappiness in the sense of like not living that complete, fully engaged, socially connected type of life, right? And that's what he's trying to do here. He's switching the metric. It's still all about the consequences. It's still all about doing the greatest good for the greatest number. But the measure is no longer pleasure and pain. The measure is happiness and unhappiness. Okay. So Mill said all of this stuff about art. Poetry. Why is poetry great? Poetry is really hard to write. It's really difficult to understand. Why should you read poetry as opposed to just like read the comics in the newspaper, right? Mill is going to say because it engages more of your faculties, and those faculties are what make you human. And any amount of you just spending time with really great works of art and literature, it makes you better. And it makes you so much better that doing that, struggling through that, and learning to enjoy those types of art forms, that is worth so much more than any comic strip in the newspaper, right? So how would Jeremy Bentham reply? Jeremy Bentham did reply, okay? And he replied in this very famous pushpin versus poetry sort of thing. Pushpin is a game that little kids used to play. You take a hat, think like a cowboy hat with like a brim, right? And kids used to carry around little sewing pins, right? The little metal pins, because it would help you to make sure that your garments fit, etc. You could take them to the tailor and get a little bit of money, I guess, for it as well. But so they had these pins, they could collect the pins to take them to tailors, etc. And they would play this little sort of gambling game where they took a hat, right? And maybe they'd set it on a bench or set it on someone's lap. And then you'd put 2 pins on the brim of the hat. And you'd take turns hitting the crown of the hat to try and get the pins to jump and move, right? And whoever could get the pins to cross on their move would be able to take both the pins. So I'd put a pin down, my opponent would put a pin down, and we'd take turns hitting the hat to try and get them to cross. And if they fell off or if they crossed, right, I would get to take the pins potentially. And so Jeremy Bentham is going to say, okay, let's compare pushpin to poetry, right? If Mill is right, poetry is worth any amount of pushpin to poetry. But Jeremy Bentham says, look, prejudice apart, the game of pushpin is of equal value with the arts and the sciences of music and poetry. So he just like says, Mill, you're being a pretentious ass right now. All right, man? More people have been able to enjoy pushpin, so it might even be the case that pushpin is better than poetry. It's still all about pleasure and pain, right? I don't care how much you wax poetic about high arts or whatever. It's about pleasure and pain, man. And he adds to this, if you disagree, it's basically just because you're a really difficult person to satisfy. It's your error, right? So Bentham bit the bullet again, right? Bit the bullet again. But no, it's just pleasure and pain, right? And if that means that pushpin is better than poetry, I'm okay with that. Because it turns out that a lot of people that like poetry are just pretentious and really hard to satisfy. Now, you don't have to buy that side either, but that's how sort of Bentham clapped back at Mill's accusation, I guess. Okay. So as I said, I was going to show you some philosophical tricks. This is the second one for the lecture. What do we do whenever we're trying to decide between multiple theories? Okay. So I could have added this at any point throughout the class, but I think it's good here, given that we have Bentham's hedonism with Mill's eudaimonism. What do we do, right? How do we decide between conflicting theories? Well, there's a couple of different things, and I'm kind of riffing on Roderick Chisholm, who's a famous epistemologist, okay? Especially in ethics, we can take one route which is called particularism, and this is not moral particularism, okay? Don't get that confused. This is a different type of particularism. Here, think of this as there's certain data that we can't give up. So maybe we think that certain things are right or wrong, or certain things are more valuable than others. Particularism says, take that data and then you form the theory around that. What is the unrevisable data that you can't give up, right? What are the ideas that you can't give up? Okay, keep those, form a theory around that. And that's different than Methodism, which is find a method. Find a systemic way of understanding the world, and then let that pick out all of the details and answer the questions. Okay? Now, there's potentially a third option with John Rawls. This is what gets called reflective equilibrium. And I think what this generally is supposed to be is a mix of the two. Maybe there are unrevisable data. Maybe there are really good theories that capture the data and you kind of use them to balance each other, right? But the reason I bring this up here is because I think that utilitarianism is a really fantastic example of Methodism, whereas Kantianism, I think, is a better example of particularism. And maybe we can get to this whenever we talk about Kantianism, right? But Methodism is the idea that you trust the method. You trust the theory that allows you to make systematic judgments, okay? And wherever that theory leads you, you think that that's the right thing because you trust the method that got you there, right? It's kind of like doing math, all right? As long as you are checking your work meticulously, or maybe even having a friend check your work, you know that if you start out with certain numbers and you're doing the operations correctly, that whatever you end up with at the end, even if it's a really big number that you couldn't predict or it's a kind of a weird answer, you're okay with that because the method has led you there, right? Whereas particularism wouldn't really make too much sense, maybe in at least not in really, not until you get to super high level mathematics, but I'm not really sure there, where you wouldn't just say like, well, I want this answer, how do I get there, right? It's Methodism is trust the system and go anywhere it takes you, okay? This matters because of the case that we're going to talk about now, right? We're going to talk about Peter Singer, and we're going to talk about his work on charity. And he has a really famous paper called Famine, Affluence, and Morality. It's, in my opinion, basically a perfect work of philosophy, okay? And, you know, I feel as though I need to sort of mention or make a caveat. Peter Singer actively gets protested against whenever he goes to talk at certain universities. And it's largely because he said some things about people, basically a consequence of his philosophy. He's a utilitarian, right? Greatest good for the greatest number. Is that parents should not bring people into this world. They shouldn't have children with very severe disabilities. Why? Because the child experiences a lot of pain, right? And it takes a ton of medical resources to care for someone, medical and social and emotional resources, to care for someone with an extreme or debilitating disability. So take some like neurodegenerative disorder where someone is legit in pain a lot of their life, and maybe they only live a few years, right? He's going to say, given that those resources could be allocated elsewhere, and given that those parents could have, you know, other children if they wanted, why would you choose to bring a life into the world that is going to experience a ton of pain and it's going to take up a lot of resources? Okay? People in the disability community and disability advocacy have taken this as a eugenic stance. That means that he's trying to kill disabled people, or he's trying to say that their lives aren't valuable. Now, I don't think that's right at all, actually. What he's trying to say, he's not, you know, talking about current lives, okay? He's talking about, again, trying to scrutinize all of your actions to make sure that they're actually bringing about the most good, or whether they're actually bringing about a lot of bad nested under, say, the guise of sanctity of life or the guise of parenthood or something like that. He would say, I don't know what those terms mean, right? could you tell me what sanctity is? Could you tell me what like the special right of children or parents are? I don't get that, right? But I do get making these types of calculations. I do get making these types of calculations. That matters, right? That matters. Peter Singer is a Methodist in the sense that we were talking about before. He trusts his philosophical method, and if it leads to a very weird conclusion, he bites the bullet because he trusts the sort of maximization of the good and minimization of the bad. Another area where he's gotten criticism for this is bestiality or zoophilia. Okay, and this is another case where most of us are super creeped out by anyone. Like if you went to a party and someone just casually mentioned, "Oh yeah, I have sex with my horse," right? Yeah, that's gonna be weird, right? That's gonna be weird. Even in context of sharing relationship stories or whatever else. And Peter Singer is gonna say, "Why? Why?" Right? If it's about pleasure and pain, right, which is just one potential metric, as long as the animal isn't being hurt. So he's completely against any sort of bestiality where the animal is being hurt, right? Maybe even the animal likes it, okay? Because the animal is loyal and the animal enjoys the stimulation, right? What causes more pleasure than pain? Okay. Maybe we shouldn't be so creeped out by that. Maybe we should be okay with that. Great example of the Methodism, right? Because even though it leads to a really weird conclusion, he's confident in his method. And his method has led him there. He's checked the results. He's checked it against multiple people. Okay, there's no reason for us to go against that, right? So I bring these up because Peter Singer is kind of one of these people who gives these cases that are incredibly hard to argue against. But whenever you reach the conclusion, even though you've probably agreed with all of the steps to that conclusion, you don't want to end up where you've ended up, right? So Peter Singer does these things, Singer cases, right? Where he starts out with a really tight argument. You're pretty much nodding your head and saying, yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. And then suddenly you end up at a conclusion. You're like, I don't know how we got here and I don't like this. But because you've been nodding your head the whole time and sort of agreeing with what's going on, it's really difficult to figure out what's going on. Okay? So Famine, Affluence, and Morality is a very specific case of this. And in this paper, he says he makes two assumptions. Assumption number one, suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. Okay? And he says, look, if you don't buy this paper isn't for you. You're maybe you're like a, I don't know, a contrarian philosopher. Maybe you're just an outright misanthrope. I'm not messing with you, right? I'm not messing with you. I think we can agree to this, and I'm just going to talk about this. He opens up with the idea of a typhoon. You could think about any natural disaster. And he just says, look, it's terrible that people are potentially going to die from not having clean water, from not having, basic medicine or food or anything like that. We should acknowledge as bad that kind of suffering, okay? Assumption number two, if it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. Okay. So this idea here is, okay, we've agreed that suffering from lack of water, food, and basic medical care is bad. We should probably also agree to the idea that if we can prevent something bad from happening without giving up something really significant to ourselves, then we should do that, right? And the should there, it's not legal, right? It's not political. It's moral. It's about us. What should I do if I want to be a good person? What should I do? Whenever you're evaluating other people, what are the kinds of things that you would say are good or bad, praise or blame, right? Thinking through a moral lens, or thinking through, from a moral perspective, it seems like it's a bad thing. If you could have prevented something without really giving up something all that important to you, If you don't do that, you're a callous and terrible person. And if you do that, you're a good person, right? If you do prevent something bad from happening, you're a good person, right? He's not talking in virtue terms. He's not talking in terms of being a good or a bad person, but he's talking about in terms of our actions. So what is the conclusion of this ultimately? Well, the conclusion is that we should donate a lot of money. Okay? Now, I've had arguments about this with many people. Some people say that this is not a consequentialist argument because it's not necessarily saying greatest good for the greatest number. He's trying to start out with these very mild assumptions that all of us can accept. I disagree. Basically, what I think he's trying to do is trying to get us to compare two different situations, right? Two different alternatives to what we're trying to do. Two different things. And we should do the one that maximizes the pleasure, minimizes the pain, over the other, or maximizes the good, minimizes the bad. Debate as to what those are, right? And he himself is from Australia. He studied in Great Britain. He is a professor at Princeton. Okay, so he's been all over the English-speaking world. And the typhoon that happened was, I think, in Bengal, that he mentions in the paper. And he's saying, look, we as people, right? And he defines the we as people in the developed world who have disposable income, we should be doing a lot more to spend that money, the money that we would spend on luxuries, to give to charities. Okay? And he's going to say, look, I know a lot of you are going to say, well, what about the charities that pay their administrators a ton of money? Okay, don't donate money to the Red Cross, all right? Don't do it. But there are effective charities out there. Example, the Against Malaria Foundation. Tons of charities have evaluated them and saw that dollar for dollar, they do a really great job of distributing malaria nets in parts of the world where malaria is very prevalent and it kills lots of people. What about the Deworm the World Foundation, right? Where literally you can give someone a very basic set of regimen of medications and now they don't have intestinal parasites and they don't run the risk of contracting lots of diseases. What about the Anti-Fistula Foundation? So a certain type of fistula could be like during childbirth, right? The uterus or the vagina can basically wear a hole and it can start to converge with the colon such that the colon leaks into the vagina. This can lead to infection and illness. And if not that, then it can lead to a ton of stigma. But the procedure to correct that is like fairly simple. You just need medical people who can do it. The Anti-Fistula Foundation, they find physicians and they pair it up with people to do that sort of thing. So there are a lot of charities out there who have high impact per dollar. Give to those, he's going to say. Well, then what about the politics? Aren't we just enabling something like that? He's going to say, well, what about a natural disaster? What are we enabling natural disasters by sending relief for natural disaster? And so one by one, he will like bat down all of the counter arguments. And you've started out with the assumptions. Okay, I agree. Suffering or dying from lack of food, shelter, and medical care is bad. I agree with that. And if I can do something without giving something of comparable moral importance to prevent a really bad thing from happening, I should do that, right? So I end up agreeing with that as well. And suddenly, that means that I should be giving up a lot of my money to help people in parts of the world live a better life, right? Okay, so I think he can make this straightforward consequentialist argument. And I'm going to give you an example, all right? I'm going to give you an example. Consider sometime in the near future, and I wish this for my students, okay? Consider that you get a decent job sometime, maybe a couple years after college, because, you know, graduating college and finding a job is tough. It takes a couple years before you land a career. But let's say you got that career. Okay. And let's say that, you know, you have a pretty good career. And let's say that it's paying you sort of a nice, comfortable salary. I don't know, $60,000, $70,000. So it's not that bad. But let's say you get benefits on top of that. So you have medical care for yourself. You also have a retirement account. All of your needs are met. You can pay all of your bills very comfortably on the salary that you make. All right. He's not talking about this. I'm obviously filling in details. Okay. So imagine that you have this kind of job. Maybe you even make more money, and that's great. This argument is going to hit even harder. And then let's say that your company says, look, we had a really fantastic quarter last quarter. I'm going to give, each of you a $5,000 bonus. Right? So you get $5,000. You don't need the money to pay any of your bills. You don't need it for anything else. What should you do with that money? Okay? This type of Singer argument is targeted exactly at those kind of luxuries. Exactly at those kinds of luxuries. Whatever you spend that $5,000 on, let's say that you have a family and that you can afford some sort of vacation. I don't know what kind of vacation you could afford for $5,000. Maybe it's like renting a cabin in the Appalachian Mountains, which I think would be really gorgeous this time of year, right? And you have a lot of, you have a lot of fun, etc. So $5,000, you have a really fantastic vacation with your family. Okay? Maybe it's something, the new PlayStation is coming out. So you get the new PlayStation, you upgrade your TV, you get lots of games, all that kind of stuff. You like take some vacation time, you order takeout for that entire week so that you can work through whatever video games you want, right? Also pretty cool. Maybe you're a musician and you want to buy some really fantastic new instruments. Whatever that $5,000 is, look, it's going to do good if you spend it in that way. He's not denying that it feels really good to do those things. And potentially, it's good that benefits more than just yourself. So taking the family on a vacation. But compare spending that $5,000 on whatever the luxury is, something you don't need, to using that $5,000 to literally save lives through effective charity. Which should you do? Which should you do? To the utilitarian, it's obvious. You have to do the one that does the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So option number one, I get a lot of pleasure from buying lots of horror movies and eating lots of pizza, right? Pretty great. Me and my dog get to go on long walks or something like that. There's some pleasure there, right? And it's pretty hefty. But does that compare at all to saving potentially dozens of lives, maybe even more than that, with $5,000? And it's not just bonuses. It's like, why should you drive an Audi, right? As opposed to just driving a Toyota? Same thing, right? Same thing. You get from A to B driving a Toyota or a Hyundai or whatever else it is, a Ford. But you could spend that extra $20,000 or whatever that you would have spent on a luxury car, and you could give that to charity and literally save lives. Why aren't you doing that? You don't have to live in the luxury condo downtown, right? The renovated condo. You could live in a more humble area of town. Why don't you do that, right? Peter Singer is saying we need to take very seriously the idea of giving up these luxuries. Assumption number 2, if it's in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought to do that. That without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, that's really, really key. Okay? Whenever I give up something like driving a luxury car, or whenever I give up buying a vintage instrument, or whenever I give up, taking a decadent vacation or whatever else, that doesn't compare to literally saving lives. Right? I literally save lives if I give to one of these effective charities. Okay? And that's the brilliance of Peter Singer. That's the brilliance. And by the way, he's gotten a lot of people to give a lot of money to charity. So whatever you think of his stances on disability, the guy has led a movement that has saved lives. He's also credited with popularizing, not necessarily starting, but popularizing the animal rights movement. He's vegan, right? So he saved lots of non-human lives as well. This guy walks the walk. He doesn't just talk the talk, right? Now, there's a couple instances in life that you could look up, you can look up his mother, whenever his mother was old and sort of nursing. I think he spent a lot of money on her particular care. And the utilitarian principle should have been maybe you don't need to do that, right? Because if you gave that same amount of money to a medical charity, you could literally save lives as opposed to just prolonging your elderly mother's life. So there are areas where, and that's one that I've heard about. I haven't necessarily confirmed that, so I feel kind of bad mentioning that. But even if it's not him, you could imagine someone else. But that's the idea. What consequentialism is trying to get us to do, or what Peter Singer is trying to get us to do, is to take a very serious look at the things that we don't need and the ways that we can help other people. Okay. But what makes this paper great isn't just that this argument is really tough. He's a really fantastic writer, and he knew that he could just give rational argumentation, but I don't know if he's taking a page from Hume or someone else. Reasons don't often move us. We need to connect things to the emotions. And so he offers an analogical argument here. So what analogies do, and what I've done in this diagram, is to show that they compare two cases, right, in an analogical argument. So the circle on the left, you can take that as the well-known case. We know how we feel about that. We know what we would do in that particular case. And then we try to say that it's the same as a case that we don't know about. And because we know what we would do in the first case, we then know what we would do in the second case, right? Case number one, I know what I would do. Turns out that I don't know what I would do in case number two. Oh, case 1 and 2 share a ton of similarities. They're analogous. So whatever I do in case 1, I should actually do in case 2. That's basically how they work, right? So what's the analogy that he draws? Again, I'm going to fill in some more details because I'm going to personalize it for you. Imagine that you're on your way to get this career, right? You don't know yet, but previous in the timeline. And you have a very nice suit on with very nice shoes. Let's even say that somehow you got like designer, custom tailored sort of stuff. And it's a few $1,000s that you have on between your shoes and your outfit. But, you know, it's a brisk fall morning and you're walking along a route. You grew up in this neighborhood and you see there's a small pond, right? You know, it's not very deep. You used to wade around in it whenever you were in high school. It's just kind of like a neighborhood feature, right? But as you're walking by this pond, you notice that there's some splashing. And then you quickly notice that there's like a toddler in the water thrashing around. It can't touch the bottom, right? And it's going to drown if you don't wade in. Now you know this spot. You know it's only a few feet deep. You know that you can just walk out there and save the toddler. You're taller than the toddler, right? It can't save itself. It's clearly drowning. You don't have time to call the cops. You don't even have time to take off your shoes or your fine tailored garments. What do? You go out into the pond and you save that life. Why? Because it seems like the right thing to do. And moreover, whenever you consider what are the negatives, because I guess there are mild negatives of doing that. You ruin your shoes, maybe you ruin your outfit, and maybe you're even late for your particular job, your job interview, right? But you literally save a life, right? You literally save a life. So whatever the bads are of you wading into that pond, they aren't anywhere near you saving a life. Does that make sense? So whenever it's a life or death situation and it's something we very easily can go in and do, we do it. But how do we compare that to something like a luxury vacation? So maybe you go to Spain and maybe you spend that $5,000 bonus on a vacation to Spain, right? He's going to say, you could give up that money and you could save lives. You don't need a vacation to Spain, right? And in fact, planes produce a ton of CO2, right? There's a lot of downsides potentially of taking that vacation that you aren't even thinking about. But even not factoring in the downsides, you could literally save lives by giving that money to an effective charity. So he's trying to show that there's relevant similarities between us saving the drowning child in the pond and us spending the money that we spend on non-essentials, on luxuries, to giving that to an effective charity, right? Okay, so quick side note, this is the Timmerman article that I've recommended for some of you. Timmerman spends a lot of time breaking down this argument. It's a very short paper. It's a really excellently written paper as well. And he tries to say that this analogy doesn't hold, okay? So whenever you build an analogy, like I said, you want to take two cases, and one case is familiar. You know what you believe in that, right? The other case is unfamiliar, but by showing that there's a lot of overlap, there's a lot of similarity, then what holds in one has to hold in the other. In order to defeat an analogy, what you can start to do is show how they're different, so you undermine the similarities, or you can offer a counter analogy. So maybe the analogy is better characterized by something else. And so the Tamler-Summers interview with Peter Singer and the Timmerman article both construct counter analogies of basically saying one of the big differences between Peter Singer and between Peter Singer's drowning child case and the contemporary case with Luxuries and world poverty is that it's not just one kid in one pond, right? It's a practical infinity, not necessarily an infinity, but you can't save all of them, right? It's a ton of ponds with a lot of drowning children who are going to die, right? And if we consider that analogy, if you consider we live in this world, and so this is dystopic and dark and very weird, but go along with it. Now the world is such that anywhere pretty much you're walking to, there's a pond with a child drowning in it. Or you're always obligated to save that child. Now, obviously not whenever you can't survive. So you're going to have to eat, right? You're going to have to sleep. You're going to have to do certain things. But now does it make any more or less sense to think about maybe enjoying a really nice meal, right? And Peter Singer says, no, I mean, I don't think that I could enjoy that meal if I knew that I could be out there saving lives, right? Other people are going to say, no, we need to take breaks, right? But the question is why? How? How do we get that? Because Singer has a really tight case, and it's really, really difficult to figure out where we disagree with him. Okay, so the other aspect that I want to bring up here are some other features of utilitarianism that generally hold. It's a big family of theories, right? But generally, okay? For Peter Singer, there are things that are irrelevant. You don't need to worry about them, or they don't make any moral difference here. Geographic proximity, okay? It doesn't matter that the people that you're helping aren't near you, okay? You're still saving lives. You're still saving lives. It just shouldn't matter. And it's related to partiality. It doesn't matter that they're a complete stranger and not someone that you care about. So whenever I heard this lecture by Tamler-Summers, he would use the example of buying his kid a really, luxurious toy. And the kid is really sweet and very mild-mannered. She was a good kid, right? And he wanted to do something special for her birthday, but on this Singer case, it should be that's not allowed, because literally you could spend whatever that money was on a really fantastic birthday gift on charity and save lives, right? But we kind of feel like we should help our kin more than we help strangers. The utilitarians say no, right? Greatest good for the greatest number involved. We're in a global world, a globalized world. It's now the case that we can easily help people in other parts of the world. Maybe not in previous centuries, right? But now we can. It doesn't matter that they're far away, and it doesn't matter that they're just strangers. Emotion. And so there's a lot of literature about this already. A lot of studies have been done. A guy named Josh Green, who's at Harvard, he wrote his dissertation under Peter Singer, and he spent some time putting people into functional MRI machines to read which parts of their brain are more active whenever they're doing things. And what Joshua Green found was that whenever people are making utilitarian judgments, as opposed to other moral theories like Kantian type judgments, because you ask them, you interview them while they're doing these questions, right? Whenever they're offering utilitarian arguments, they're using the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, or basically parts of the forebrain, the stuff at the very front, the outside wrinkly bits that have evolved most recently and most extensively in humans. It's where we can do abstract thought, where we can do projections into the future, where we can do really complex cognitive tasks. Whereas other types of moral evaluations tend to be emotion centered or very heavy in the mid parts of the brain where there's a lot of emotional aspects going on. And Joshua Green tries to say this shows that utilitarianism is correct because it's using the most advanced and the most recently evolved and complex parts of the brain, right? Now, you don't necessarily have to buy that type of evolutionary argument, but that's kind of what's going on here. But Peter Singer, he's going to put it more bluntly and just say, look, emotions don't matter for morality. Maybe they matter in some sort of secondary sense where you have to calculate what goods are being maximized, right? Because maybe the emotional well-being counts as a good that you need to consider. But your knee-jerk reactions to things or how certainly you feel about things, that doesn't matter. Because what finds the moral truth is comparing things and seeing which one maximizes the greatest good for the greatest number of people, right? That's what matters. That's a cognitive calculation. It doesn't give a crap about your feelings. Your feelings are irrelevant, okay? And that's why he will say stuff like the bestiality case is okay. Because that, for most people, feels really disgusting, very transgressive, very unusual, right? And Peter Singer is going to say, I don't care about your feelings. All I care about is maximizing the good for the most number of people, or the most number of any organisms that can experience good, right? And so emotion basically isn't relevant for a lot of this stuff. Now, again, these are the mainline theories. Other consequentialists have tried to find ways around this, but I don't think that there are really any effective ways around this. Emotion doesn't matter, right? Emotion doesn't matter. Consider, Aristotle, emotion matters a lot. You are not fully virtuous if you do not feel good about doing good things and if you haven't trained your emotions. For David Hume, they matter even more because your sentiments, especially extensive sympathy, right? That's what the basis of moral theory is. Peter Singer, no. This is entirely rational. This is entirely looking at the consequences of the actions. Emotions don't matter here. It doesn't matter that you feel more for your child, right? And you feel nothing for a stranger. The emotions don't matter. Do the thing that produces the best consequences. And this is an interesting one as well, whether other people help. So one of the big objections to Peter Singer is like, look, we could solve these problems if pretty much everyone pitched in, but it's useless. I can't end the problem all by myself. And he's going to say, okay, that's fine, right? And it would be better if everyone pitched in, because if everyone pitched in, we'd just have to give a little bit. We wouldn't have to give nearly enough. But literally, you could save lives, and you could save lives at the expense of your luxury, not at the expense of anything that's going to put you in danger. Why wouldn't you help people out? Why wouldn't you save the lives? Because those are literally the stakes. People will die of malaria. People might die of intestinal parasites, right? You're telling me that the new PlayStation or an Audi or a luxury vacation is more important than that? That's what he's forcing you to say. Now, you don't have to buy it, right? But if you don't, you have to find a reason why. And that's the tricky part, okay? I love this paper. It's probably come across in the way that I've talked about it, even though I myself am not a utilitarian. I think this paper is incredible. I think it's well written. It has real world impact. It's clear. It's rigorously argued. This is just like how you should write philosophy, in my opinion, right? But more recently, given the political context of the US and divisiveness, right? The gap between the ultra wealthy and the people who are basically not even getting by. I think that this is also very brilliant because it doesn't use politics. It just puts it to the fore. It doesn't matter what political party you're a part of. This shows why incredibly wealthy people, for example, multimillionaires and billionaires who buy luxury goods, are heartless. Okay? Why are they heartless? Because they seem to think that whatever pleasure they get out of having 2 or 3 bungalows in different countries or luxury cars, they are owed that pleasure over the good that it could do to their own country folk or to people around the world. Don't even have to bring politics into this. All you have to say is, assume you have $20 million, okay? If you have $20 million, all right, you could potentially put that in the bank and live off of the interest for the rest of your life, right? Because $20 million, let's assume a modest set of investments on $20 million yields maybe 3% annually. And that's very, very modest. $20 million in the bank would amount to $600,000 per year just on interest. Doesn't include whatever money you make at a job. Doesn't include, other types of opportunities that you might have. Doesn't include spending the principal amount. You're literally just making $600K in interest. Okay? Now imagine that. And let me pull up the calculator. Because like 20 million doesn't, like, there's so many athletes that make that kind of money. But even just 600,000 would be $50,000 per month. Per month. And let's say that half of that is taxed, right? So now you have $25K per month. People in America there are a lot of people in America who don't even make that in a year, right? And so Peter Singer is going to say, okay, let's look at a person like that. You got 20 mil in the bank. They're living off the 600K in interest. Not even going to talk about the principal amount, although this argument will clearly apply to that. Let's say you have 25K per month in income. All right? What money do you need to live comfortably? Honest question, right? Let's say it's $10,000. So roughly $120,000 of income that you're spending, right? That's not including taxes. That leaves $15K per month that you could be giving to charity and giving up nothing that you need. You could live super comfortably on $10,000 per month. So this sort of strategy, I think, is really brilliant. Really, really brilliant. And it cuts against a lot of economic arguments, right? So people could say, well, like, I don't care. They earn their money, right? Or they worked really hard. Or doesn't it stimulate the economy? And the answer is like, no, not really. It's just sitting in a bank. Maybe it's even in an offshore account. Maybe you hire an accountant to do weird stuff to your taxes, right? So you don't even have to pay that much in taxes. The economy is usually better off whenever that money is in circulation anyway. And in circulation, I mean like out there in consumer goods, the service sector, that kind of stuff, right? Or literally helping other parts of the world. Well, they should be entitled to living pretty well. Well, $10,000 per month, right? Not including taxes or whatever else, or including, right? Because all of that has already been paid. What are you doing? What are you doing? And that's what this consequentialist argument is trying to get us to do, right? whatever I spend that $10,000 on for myself in a situation like that per month, it doesn't amount at all to the good that it could do by literally saving lives around the world, right? And Singer is saying, if you choose to spend it on yourself, are you not making a morally monstrous decision? Don't you deserve a little bit of flack for doing that sort of thing? Now, again, you could disagree with this, but the trick is going to try to find a reason that he doesn't address in this paper, or that doesn't sound just really, really callous and really strange. Because you agreed to those initial two assumptions. Suffering from the basic stuff is bad. If you can help without giving anything up of comparable moral importance, you should do that, right? And I think that's really brilliant. And you can use this strategy, right? You don't have to talk politics. You can just pose this scenario. And I think Peter Singer, I haven't found a suitable way to get around his argument, right? I'm still not living as well as I should according to him, but I have to say that after hearing a lot of Peter Singer's talks, it has made me donate money to things like the Against Malaria Foundation and stuff like that, because I think he's right. And I don't think that there's an easy way to argue against him, right? So that's a really famous case in philosophy, obviously. And I'm going to show you one last philosophical trick. I know this lecture is getting long. One last philosophical trick. But this is often called one person's ponens is another person's tollens, okay? And these are argumentative forms. They're both valid arguments. So the conclusion follows from the premises, but I just want to show you something here. So they're both going to start with this first premise. If utilitarianism is right, then we must donate money, okay? It's not saying that utilitarianism is right. It's not saying that we should donate money. It's linking the two. If utilitarianism is right, so if Peter Singer is right, then we should donate money. And then if we find out that utilitarianism is correct, what do we get as a conclusion? So we have to donate money, right? So if you have if A, then B, and then you get the A, you get the B. The modus tollens works in the same way. Again, if utilitarianism is right, we must donate money. Same exact first premise. But what this is going to say is utilitarianism is not right. And as a conclusion, we get, that's wrong. In fact, that's so wrong. I'm going to correct that right now. So I'm sorry that I have to sort of break the fourth wall, but this is a severely huge error. So it should be, we need not donate. So utilitarianism is wrong. I am really sorry about that. But, okay, here we are. Same first premise. But if we deny this second part, if we don't get the second part, then we know that whatever led to that also didn't happen, okay? So if we find out that we don't need to donate money to charity, then we know that whatever leads to that can't be the case, right? So utilitarianism is wrong. Okay? And you could kind of think about this in this. I'll give you a different set of propositions. If I drink bourbon, then I fall down. Okay? If I drink bourbon, then I fall down. I just know that, right? It links me drinking bourbon to falling down. If you find out later that I drank bourbon, then you know that I also fell down. But if you find out later that I didn't fall down, then you know that I didn't drink bourbon. So that's kind of what's going on in this modus ponens, modus tollens sort of case. So I apologize about that error, but I have it correct now on the screen. So if utilitarianism really does try to get us to donate to charity, right? But then we find out that that obligation just doesn't hold. What that ends up meaning is that we should distrust any theory that is giving us an unintuitive result. So this one person's ponens is another person's tollens is a way theoretically of saying we can start out at the same spot. But certain people are going to find evidence that's going to lead to take the conclusion from the system that they trust in. Again, think of the Methodism. You trust the method, so you're going to trust whatever conclusions it leads to. But other people are going to use particular data to say that judgment just doesn't make sense. Therefore, I'm going to distrust any theory that leads to that judgment. Right? And so that's how some people are going to deal with this utilitarian stuff. If the utilitarians are constantly giving you unintuitive, recommendations like you should donate all of the money that you spend on luxuries to charities, like bestiality with animals that aren't harmed by it and may even enjoy it, that's okay. That aborting children who have really severe neurodegenerative disorders or whatever else it is to avoid all of the pain in their lives that would happen if they were born, that is morally required or morally okay. If they keep giving you those types of things, if you're the Methodist and you trust the method, you're going to say, okay, those feel weird to me, but I don't trust my emotions. I trust my method. I'm going to believe in those particular bits of data, right? Greatest good for the greatest number involved. I've done the calculations. This does go for the greatest good for the greatest number. Versus other people are going to say, look at all of those results. I don't trust a single one of those, and you've given me many of them. Therefore, doesn't that say something weird about the theory that's led you there? And that's more the particularist strategy. There are these data that I can't give up, or these data that I know how I feel, and I need to find a theory that coheres to that, right? And so this one person's ponens is another person's tollens it's another way of reiterating that bite the bullet versus revise the theory sort of thing. The ponens side is the bite the bullet. Yeah, it's leading to unintuitive consequences. I'm okay with that. Let me soften that by selling this to you in a slightly different way. The revising the theory is refusing to go along with the theory that led you there. Okay? So this has been a really long, now stuff is getting complicated now that we have multiple moral theories on the table, right? But what's going on with utilitarianism is I think it's elegant and I think it's powerful. Okay? I didn't have to spend a lot of time this lecture to explain what it is to you. Greatest good for the greatest number. You do the action that has the best consequences, effects, or results. What is the good? Pleasure and pain if you're a hedonist, happiness and unhappiness if you're a eudaimonist, right? But still, greatest good for the greatest number involved. That's it. That's it. In comparing actions, you just compare which one does the most good or avoids the most bad for the most number of people, right? I didn't have to go on to lecture about virtues and vices or eudaimonia. I'm not going to have to lecture like I will in the future about, Kantian moral theories and how those duties hold. I just explained it to you. It's easy, but it's powerful. The utilitarians have been ahead of the curve. Anti-slavery, pro-women's rights, pro-access to contraceptives and medical care, against things like corporal punishment, so beating people in public, pro animal rights, such that we shouldn't have factory farming where animals are just like really in terrible conditions. They've used that theory to be ahead of the curve on all of those issues. Those were unpopular opinions back in, the 18th and 19th and even parts of the 20th century, right? And that's what something like a utilitarian theory can get you. Because you aren't basing things on emotions, because you're not going along with social prejudices, you end up potentially, maybe not in all cases, potentially finding right answers, right? But to some people, they're gonna say, look, these are weird results, and I don't know what to do with them. And so I haven't spent any time at all in this lecture really talking about the counterexamples. So I gave the ones by Bernard Williams. I gave some other ones. His name is escaping me, with the negative utilitarianism. I gave the ones from Robert Nozick. I gave the short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula K. Le Guin. All of those counterexamples can be used, weren't necessarily written for this, but they can be used to argue against certain versions of utilitarianism. They can be argued to say, look, if you take this impartial, God's eye point of view type of thing, you could potentially be doing something very monstrous and exploiting a small minority for the greater good, right? But the utilitarian is also always going to come back and they're going to say, look, I get that. And let's try not to do that. We have to take very seriously the suffering component. And some utilitarians are going to say the suffering component actually counts way more than the positive component. These are negative utilitarians. I'm not going to go into it, but that's a potential route that you can take. But they're going to say, I think that the greater danger is our emotions or our social conventions clouding our rationality and getting us to just justify the status quo, justify what's already happening. You don't have to agree with this, right? But you just have to know this particular perspective. Because after we lay out the normative theories, then we're going to start to apply these particular issues. And that's what's going on here. That's what's going on here. So virtue ethics talks about a good life and the kind of person you have to be in order to get that. Utilitarians take things out of the character considerations and they put things more toward the actions. And given that you're looking at actions, you don't even really care too much about the action. You care about the consequences that follow from it. Greatest good for the greatest number. Greatest good for the greatest number. Okay? And they're going to say, even though it gives me weird results from time to time, I trust it, man. I trust it. And it's historically, whenever you do the calculations correctly, it's led us to be on the right side of history more often than not. And that's what makes this theory, on the one hand, very alarming, because it gives us weird results. And we feel uneasy about justifying things for the via the greater good, right? But on the other hand, you look at the track record, you look at its elegance, and you look at the things that it's actually recommending, and suddenly this theory that gets insulted a lot doesn't seem so crazy. And so I think that that's kind of like, that's it, right? That's the rub. So thank you so much. That was an incredibly long lecture. I hope that it made sense. If you have any questions, let me know, right? We can schedule some time on Discord. You could even ask in the comment sections and I'll try to reply as quickly as possible. Thank you for spending your time with me. I will see y'all next time.